Jesus set a little child in their midst and said, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. So which of you is going to change her nappy?" That's the problem, isn't it? It all sounds very uplifting and glorious, this being the servant of others and being humble. But it runs counter to our natural inclinations, because the servant gets the grotty jobs and the dirty jobs, the bits that no one else wants, at the time when no one else wants to do them, and has no control over what they get given to do. And that is the problem with human nature. It likes to be in control. It likes to have power. When it comes to groups of people, people like to boss other people around. And power, as has been said, corrupts. Or as someone more brutally put it once, the only point of having power is to be able to abuse it. And a little more subtly than that, I think, power attracts the sort of people who are most likely to be corrupted. They enjoy wielding it. And on the other hand, the role of the servant is not one that by and large people choose. It's ill-rewarded, unpleasant and demanding. And nursery attendants, care assistants earn somewhat less than company CEOs. And although in terms of human longevity and public health, dustbin men are actually more important than brain surgeons, that's not reflected in remuneration or in esteem. People want to be top of the pile, but that's the human attitude which the disciples had fallen prey to, and which Jesus has to radically combat in their discipleship and confront. See, the problem about power at all levels is that it's a form of self-protection, and we hate to renounce it because it makes ourselves vulnerable. Where will it end? It's all right doing an act of kindness, but if you set out to make yourself a servant, they'll come back for another act of kindness, and another one, and another one. No one would not welcome a refugee into their country. But 100,000? 1 million? And we're seeing that question in Europe, aren't we? Where will it end? Jesus' answer was, that's the question you shouldn't ask. But he knew we always would. It's just that it sometimes needs counter-attacking, struggling against the human tendency to power, to self-protection, to self-absorption. That is what had got hold of the disciples. Think what was going on. Jesus was teaching them about what was going to happen in Jerusalem, the most momentous event, and the centre and truth of the gospel, which he wanted them to grasp. And what were they doing? They were arguing about who was the greatest. Human beings dislike being vulnerable, being servants. It's something that's best left to saints. I did once meet a saint, or at least probably the nearest anybody's ever going to come to. I didn't meet him. Well, he's talked to a group of clergy. His name was Jean Vonnier, and he founded the Larch communities. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're homes for the disabled, and often really severely handicapped. And they work on the principle that there's no carers and cared for. It is a community. It happened because Jean Vanier, who is nobody's pushover, is an French naval officer, but he somehow came into contact with a home for the disabled and was appalled at the treatment being meted out to two young men, and so he simply took them into his own home as his friends. And that's how a large community works. And he maintains, because he's a saint, that he gets back as much from them as he gives to them. But he recalled one young man whose mother died. And this was a young man with severe, we would call them learning disabilities or whatever, but had no real way of expressing himself. And the only way he could express his grief was to howl. And Jean Vanier and the doctor of the community decided that they had to let him, because that was the only way he could express himself. And so he wasn't sedated, he wasn't restrained, he was allowed to howl. And he did. And he did. And he did. And Jean Vanier, the saint, said, I came to realize that we all have it within us, the will to murder another human being. Being a servant eventually pushes even saints to the edge. So, what's the point of an ideal if no one can quite live up to it? But that's the whole point of an ideal. To have something which is beyond your reach, but which shows you where you should be going. It prevents you accepting the mediocre as the norm. Prevents you accepting the excuses as the truth. Prevents you from hiding away from the fact that human weakness is very often another word for sin. I knew a guy once who used to simply say when anything happened or he did anything outrageous, say, well, that's just me. It's a great excuse. It did ultimately land him in jail. That's just me. Excuses we hide from ourselves, and the ideals prevent us hiding. And as for this ideal of being a servant and all being a servant of all, as was spelt out in our first hymn, which I must admit I find quite stomach-churning, really. I can't live up to that. I like to be in control. It's not that I'm a control freak, I'm just bossy. And we all are to some extent. But if this ideal was more honoured, more held up, if more people did despair of achieving it because they'd tried, then it would be a world in which bankers simply thought of themselves as the humble stewards of other people's hard-earned savings, those with the precious and onerous task of guarding other people's pensions. It would be a one in which hospital CEOs said, I must have at least one day a week free to help out on the geriatric wards or the A&E, because otherwise I won't really know what's going on, because I won't get it from the boxes that are ticked, but from understanding what it's like to serve in this institution. And if governments and their bureaucracies really did consider themselves as Tony Blair once described himself, as servants of the people. It would be a different world. And what if the church said, our real business here is not singing hymns, it is not sustaining historic buildings, it is not fancy robes and vestments. We are here to be the servants of all, as Christ was the servants of all. We will ensure that the major part of our expenditure goes on other people. And we'll make sure our churches have enough money for that to be the case. And we will give our time so that it can be done. What if the main activity of the church were acts of mercy, charity, and loving kindness? Jesus did not instruct his disciples to be servants because it was a catchy slogan or a nice soundbite. He said it because they clearly and utterly had not got the point. They really hadn't understood what it was all about. He was trying to tell them he was going up to Jerusalem to be crucified and to be raised. There's some good news in the gospel. But they couldn't understand, and they couldn't hear, because they were arguing over which of them was the greatest. Being so self-absorbed, they were not being gracious. Being so self-absorbed, they couldn't understand the nature of grace. For self-absorption, as St. Augustine once so wisely remarked, self-absorption, not money, but self-absorption is the root of all sin. And to Jesus Christ, who came not to be served, but to serve, and absorbed himself solely in the will of God and the love of man, be glory forever and ever. Amen.